All right, guys and gals, I just want to kind of do a review of the American Civil War, the causes of the American Civil War. So I'm going to go over these notes that we've already taken in class. If I was you, if you guys want to jot a couple of notes down, you totally can. If you don't want to, it's fine. This is obviously going to be here for your guys' use. If you were to create your own notes, the essential question would be, what were the causes of the American Civil War? It's pretty self-explanatory. Some of this stuff I'm going to go over really quickly because we've kind of gone over this multiple times in class. And some of this stuff I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, okay? So we start off with, two sides. You have the Union and the Confederate Army. The Union is the North, Confederates are the South. They're going to be embarked on the Civil War. We've talked about this multiple times. The Missouri Compromise was that compromise that basically was trying to create an idea that there should be, every time a state enters into the Union, one should be free and the other one should be slave. Okay, and that was at 1820. Missouri, in this case, was the exception, right? Because it was divided. To keep Congress balanced, Maine was added as a free state to create, again, that 50-50 split. Congress didn't want one group, either Union or Confederate, free or slave states, to gain too much power. Because if they gain too much power, that means they'd control Congress, and in that same sense, unfortunately, one group would basically be taken advantage of. Missouri was confirmed as a slave state. Maine would enter as a free state and would continue that separation, okay, that 50% down the middle. And this is where we're going to kind of get our first Band-Aid, again, of the divide between the nations, trying to not create a civil war. Unfortunately, this is going to happen no matter what. But again, all these compromises, all these things that are put in place were Band-Aids to stop the Civil War from actually occurring. Okay. Of course, later there'd be a conflict. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846, okay, basically proposed a bill talking about, the banned slavery within the United States, the Mexican gained territory. Again, this would be a huge issue because we gained a ton of states when it came to the Wilmot Proviso after the Mexican-American War. So if we were going to enter in all those states as free, that would not be a clear divide between, free and slave states. And then Congress would be unequal. And then you'd have a lot of complications when it came to, what the South wanted, what the North wanted. Remember, South was an agrarian nation. They're the ones that did slavery. The North was obviously divided, started their, the Industrial Revolution, and they were profiting from that. Same with the South. You had the Cotton Kingdom. So they definitely did not want there to be, an uneven divide when it came to states entering in. The bill caused an uproar with slave-owning states. Obviously, they didn't want all these states to enter in as free because they wouldn't hold the power in Congress. And what ended up happening is, obviously, the Wilmot Proviso does not go through. It's rejected clearly, as obviously Southern states do not want the North to take control over Congress. Compromise of 1850. Again, something we talked about multiple times. Okay, it's when California entered the Union. This is when they decided to say that states would decide through their own governing board, through their own citizens, if they'd be free or if they'd be a slave state. Now, California was going to be very important to both sides because in 1849, we know the gold rush happens. There is a considerable boom within population. You had people not only from all over the United States, but you also had people from Asia and other parts of the world that were flocking to California to try to, stake their claim in gold. So gold was going to be a huge asset when it comes to this state. And again, you had Southern diplomats trying to persuade the California government to, push them to be more slave, that would benefit them. And then you have the Union obviously pushing California to be obviously free, how that could benefit them, with the Industrial Revolution, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, California would obviously become free, but this again would create hostility within Congress between Southern states and Northern states, free and slave. Southern states obviously do not want California to be free because they'd have a majority in Congress. Senator Henry Clay proposed this compromise, again, that would basically take down the 3630 line and create a new line. And again, this would be to avoid another conflict between the North and the South. Okay. Kind of already talked about this, allowing these newly acquired states to vote whether or not they want to be slave or non-slave states within the Western United States territories. This would abolish again the Compromise of 1820, which would this conflict would obviously create riots between pro and anti-slavery states. Okay. This what would allow from the Compromise of 1850 is this Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave territories, slave states, to send these bounty hunters that we talked about in class up to the north from slaves who fled the South via the Underground Railroad or something else, and allow these bounty hunters to go and basically grab these slaves from the north and bring them back down. Remember, Canada was that promised land. If you're able to enter into Canada, the Fugitive Slave Act would be voided because Canada was another nation. That law did not go into Canada. So when a lot of these slaves from the South were trying to evacuate and flee southern states, the big thing was going to Canada because there was no way the fugitive bounty hunters could be able to capture them. We kind of went over this. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Okay. We talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. She writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is going to create an uproar within the South. It basically showed a negative light on Southern use of slaves in the South. It was a very derogatory book towards the Southerners, and they'd become more and more upset with this Northern literature that was going to be developed. It was one of the most popular books of its time. Sold 245,000 copies in the United States. It was second to the Bible during that year. So not only people in the North were reading it, but people in the South were reading it because obviously they're kind of interested to see what they had to say. We're going to kind of bypass this because we've just talked about it. The book was very controversial. It made an uproar within the South. They were very upset. It sparked argument, debate, and conflict not only within the states but also in Congress. Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. These were new territories that were going to be decided between, obviously, the states, whether they're going to be slave or non-slave. This is when we start finding out or start understanding this idea of border states, where when the Civil War begins, they're quite divided. You have brothers versus brothers because, Kansas is on that border of, free to non-free, southern territories compared to northern territories. So you had people who grew up differently, some of them, that just had different mindsets. One family member could believe in slavery because they had a plantation, and another family member down the road could believe that slavery was terrible and should be abolished. Talk about Bleeding Kansas. There's going to be an uproar specifically within Kansas. Voters crossed Missouri to vote on slavery, creating two opposing governments, pro and anti-slavery. President Pierce was going to recognize pro-slavery within the government. There's a dispute. There's an attack on Lawrence. 800 people rode to Lawrence and arrested the anti-slavery leaders. Leaders fled the town that was being sacked, and basically people were being tarred and feathered, beaten to a pulp, and it was not a good look for the United States government. You have the Potomac massacre, led by John Brown, who basically wanted to get his men. He was wanting to kill, obviously, pro-slavery, Brown and his men killed 5 pro-slavery men. Their whole idea was to bombard this military hold where they had a bunch of artillery and things like that, and create an uprising against the pro-slavery movement. They obviously would fail, and they'd be killed in the act of doing so. There's a picture of Brooks attacking Sumner. Criticizing, obviously, the pro-slavery movement. Kansas insulted Senator Andrew Pickens Butler from South Carolina. And again, we have a dispute within Congress. Dred Scott versus Sanford. We talked about Dred Scott. He was a slave who wanted to basically sue for his freedom and ended up getting to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court stated that under constitutional law during the time period, unfortunately, he was considered property and he would not be able to be considered a freeman and have to go and obviously go back to slavery. What this did do in a positive light is it showed that this was something that was coming to be, this idea that slavery would be stopped if it was able to get to the Supreme Court and actually be disputed. We already talked about John Brown's Harper's Ferry, so we'll bypass that. When it came to the election of 1860, we talked about this in class a little bit. Abraham Lincoln was going to run for presidency under a new political domain, which is the Republican Party. It was a new party. It had been a third party during the time period. Now, again, the only reason why Abraham Lincoln won this election is because the Democrats within the United States had 3 people running for presidency instead of just having one Democrat within their candidacy running against Lincoln. They had 3, so those 3 people divvied up the votes, which essentially was one of the leading reasons why Abraham Lincoln won, is because Democrats in the South, the North, everywhere in the United States, might have liked Stephen Douglas better than John Breckinridge, than John Bell. So by dividing those Democratic votes up to the Democratic Party, they were not able to acquire not only the electoral votes needed, but also the popular votes needed. And Abraham Lincoln would come with the sweep. So Abraham Lincoln, Republican. John Bell, constitutional unionist. So directly from the Constitution. Southern Democrat, John Breckinridge, who obviously was very keen on the Southern ideology, on the idea that slaves should still be their property and used for their own economic gains. And then you had Stephen Douglas, who was just a Democrat, who was running and basically had some of the same ideology as both of his counterparts. Abraham Lincoln won the election and became the 16th president. After that is when you have secession. Okay, so the first state, that would secede from the United States would basically be right, even before the inaugural address, which is South Carolina, December 20th, 1860. They'd become quite upset and outraged by Lincoln earning his presidency. Remember, he's elected president in November, and basically directly after South Carolina secedes. And then you basically have this domino effect. You have Florida, January 20th, 1861. Alabama, January 11th, 1861. You have Georgia, January 19th, 1861, and you guys get the drift. Everyone starts seceding. Okay, you have the attack on Fort Sumter, which again is the only basically bloody battle within the United States. No one actually dies except for that poor horse. Obviously doesn't get out in time. April 12th, 1861, the first shots are fired on the Confederacy. The first shots are fired on the Civil War would be fired in Fort Sumter by what would become the Confederacy. This was the first true war event. It's in South Carolina, and war would break out. Okay, and then after Battle of Fort Sumter, you have some other states that would secede as well. Virginia, April 17th, May 6th, Arkansas, so on and so forth. The crazy part is a lot of these states, especially when you talk about like Virginia, Tennessee, the border states per se. Again, this war is not just between Unionists and Confederates, people that believe in slavery and obviously people who are against slavery. It becomes much, much more than that. Again, the idea that this is going to be the bloodiest war in our history. Brothers are fighting against brothers. Family members are going to be fighting against family members. This is going to be a long, drawn-out war that the Union figures is going to be over in the matter of weeks, maybe a month. And they're going to be quite surprised when it comes with the Civil War and the Confederacy. Again, you guys, obviously I was talking fast. You can pause it, listen to it as much as you want. Take as many notes as you want. On Wednesday, we're going to have a quiz. It's going to be coming directly from these slides, so it should be quite easy for you guys. I'm just going to answer a couple questions, and then hopefully you guys will be able to get the max points needed on that specific quiz. I believe I'm going to have it around 35 points. Talk to you guys soon. Again, if you have any questions, please email me, or you can obviously use Flipgrid.